Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're going to be taking a look at a game on the PC-98, and that is Kuro Noken, Blade of Darkness. And of course, whenever I see Noken in the name of something, the first thing that comes to my mind is Hokuto no Ken, and with knowing that, I have to unfortunately report that this game is not about Kenshiro with a sword, because, well, that would have been awesome. But anyways, all jokes aside though, this game was developed and published by Forest, and was released in 1995, though there was other versions of this game, like there was a Windows version in 96, and in 97 it got ported to PS1. And one interesting thing I have to mention about the company Forest is that not only did they have a subversion of their company that was called Foster, but also, this is the only game that I found in their catalog that is not a hentai game. So I guess you could say they are literally a forest of hentai. And the game happens to be a turn-based RPG with a fantasy setting. So without further ado, let's talk about the story first. So there are two main characters within this game, but the first one that you play as is Shinobu. She is a ninja girl that is from the dark-haired tribe, and as she was traveling across the sea, her ship ends up getting wrecked, and then she ends up getting rescued by some red-haired thief. And that thief tells her to try to steal something from the rich nobles, and that's pretty much where her journey begins. So while all this is going on, the other character that this game focuses on is named Kaisu. And he's a warrior knight who is looking for the Blade of Darkness, you know, the name of the game. And the reason he is looking for this sword is because there is a group of people who are trying to resurrect the Black Dragon. And as you can imagine, the Black Dragon was a thing that almost destroyed the world many years ago, and the only thing that stopped it was this Blade of Darkness, so that's why he is looking for it. And that sums up the basics of what you need to know about the starting point of these two characters, and yes, they do eventually meet each other and have to work together to put a stop to all this. And as always, I'm not going to get into any spoiler stuff, as I always do encourage people to trying these games out themselves and tell me what they think about them. But I will mention some small moments later on though, so one other thing I should mention too is that even though this game is made by a company who mostly made a lot of hentai games, the game may not have any nudity in it, but it still has some stuff that are a little bit fanservice-y, but it is very tame compared to the usual stuff that this company does. I would say that the amount of tameness that this game has is probably on the same level as Rusty on PC-98. So now, as for the game's gameplay, it's a pretty typical top-down turn-based RPG, very similar to something you would see on Super Nintendo. And if you're here, I'm sure you have played an old-school RPG before at least once, so yeah, there's really not a whole lot to talk about here, such as going to towns, buying items and upgrades, you run around a map, you go to dungeons, and there's random encounters, you know. Although the one thing that this game does do differently that is very, very forgiving is that every time you run around on the map, you actually gain back your health and MP a bit, which definitely makes the game a lot easier. Now when it comes to the battles in this game, they are turn-based, and as again, they are pretty typical of the stuff that you would see on the Super Nintendo. And if you want to know what the menus are, I did translate them for you here, so if you do want to play this game soon, then feel free to screen cap this. So yeah, everything is very easy to understand what you're doing here, but two interesting things I have to say is that sometimes when you attack physically, your character will attack multiple times within the same turn, and sometimes your characters can block and can even do a counterattack. And like I said about your characters gaining health and MP on the map, well, in battle, after every turn, if you do a physical attack or an item or defend, you can gain a little bit of MP back, but you can't generate your health during battle though. So knowing that there are two ways you can gain back some MP without having to use items does make this game pretty damn easy and forgiving, and maybe a little bit overpowered. So now let's get moving on and start talking about the other things, like the graphics. And no surprise, as someone that has talked about PC-98 games a whole bunch of times, yes, I do love the way how this one looks too. I really love the game's bright colors and all the textures and all that. The two main character designs I think are pretty cool looking, and I really love a lot of the CG cutscene graphics in this game. They all look really beautiful and nice. And I really love the look of the battle screens too for that. They have some really nice big sprites with some really cool animations. And I find that the sprite work in this game almost does remind me a little bit of like a Neo Geo game like Samurai Showdown RPG. It kind of does remind me of that vibe a little bit. And the game's attack animations are really cool looking, and thankfully, even though they are cool looking, they're actually pretty quick and don't take up too much time to get through, which is always nice. The only negative thing I would have to say about the visuals though, is that some of the enemy designs in this game are a little bit generic. Now yes, I do like the look of all the monster sprites, like they do look cool for what they are, but I do feel like that there's not a lot of like really unique enemies in this game. Like there is a couple of them, but not a lot. But yeah, there's a lot of enemies in this game that are just your typical stuff that you've seen in like almost every other RPG, like your slimes, your skeletons, your rocks, you know. But at least they did make these generic looking enemies look kinda cool for what they are though. So yeah, that's really the only negative thing I have to say about the visuals though. Everything else I do really like a whole lot. And as for the game's music, I actually think it's quite good personally. There is a couple songs that I do find to be fairly catchy and do get stuck in my head, and I really like some of the more atmospheric tracks for some of the dungeons and certain special areas of the game. Those ones are probably my favorite, but I do think most of the other ones are pretty solid enough and are decently memorable. And I also did check out the music for the PS1 version out of curiosity, and I have to say, I actually still like most of them in the PC-98 version better. But there is a couple standout ones in that version that I can give some credits to for being fairly good, but yeah, I do think that the PC-98 soundtrack is more consistently good in my opinion. Now, before we get moving on to the next thing, one thing I should bring up that I forgot to mention earlier was that I actually used a walkthrough of this game to help me play through it, and that walkthrough was done by Wallach on YouTube, so huge thank you to them for providing that. But even though I was playing through the PC-98 version, there's no real major differences when it comes to how you play through the game. The only real differences it has is just the technical things like the graphics and the music. It also does have some load times unfortunately, but it also does have some voice acting. And since I heard the voice acting in that version to help me play through this game, I figured I might as well talk about it here. And it does have a pretty cool cast. Now obviously I'm not going to go over every single one here, but for the main two characters, so Kaisu is being played by Takahito Koyasu, who is an amazing voice actor who has done a ton of really cool stuff, but the one iconic role that a lot of people know him for is... Yeah, so it's kind of amusing to see him playing the main character of the game like this. And then Shinobu is being played by Junko Iwao. Two iconic roles that I know her for is she was Tomoyo from Cardcaptor Sakura, and she was also the main character in Perfect Blue. And one that surprised me that I didn't know she did was that she was in Grandia 2 as Tio. And the rest of the cast has a lot of really cool people too. In fact, the game was even narrated by Banjo Ginga, who has been in like a ton of different things. So that is one nice advantage that the PS1 version does have over the PC-98 one. Now, if you wanted to go out and buy yourself a copy of this game, well, no surprise, I did not find a single copy on eBay for the PC-98 version, but I did see 3 of them for the PS1 version. Cheapest I've seen it for was $54.44, and the highest I've seen it for was $72. So the game isn't cheap, but it's also not stupidly overpriced. Which honestly, I am kinda shocked by, as it seems like most games that I've been finding out lately, they've all been like at least over $100 or close to $100. But if you did want to own a physical copy of this game just to have a really cool looking box art, then yeah, it's not like the worst price ever. And speaking of the box art, one amusing thing I did find out about was that in another game that was developed by Foster, called Paradise Heights 2, in the bedroom there is a poster of this game, which I thought was kinda cool looking. So now, as my overall thoughts on Kuro Noken, The Blade of Darkness, is that it is a bit of an average game, but I actually did somewhat like it. Like, I'll say this, the game isn't super great, and it isn't anything, like, super revolutionary, and not that everything has to be, but I did find that the game was at least a bit of above average. So I'll go over everything else. So, when it comes to the game's story, yeah, it's a bit of a generic fantasy story, and it wasn't bad, but it also wasn't really anything like super crazy and unique. Like, one part I will say that was probably the most amusing part of the game was that, so there is a golem that is in a town blocking your way from crossing over the bridge, and once you kill him, there is a witch that gets mad at you for killing her cute little golem, and then later on in the game, she comes back and she's like super pissed at you, and it's actually pretty amusing. It's by far the most memorable part about the story that was not only funny, but was also a little bit more over the top. But yeah, outside of that, the story was pretty average. And while the gameplay is pretty standard for this type of game as well, I strangely still kinda liked it, as it was a pretty chill game, and I also just really like seeing all the different magical spell animations, as a lot of them are really cool looking. And I also did like some of the dungeons as well, as I did found that a lot of them were usually not too much of a pain in the ass to navigate, which is always nice. Also, I didn't even mention too that you can save literally anywhere you want in this game, so that's definitely one thing that is very handy. But the one thing about this game that I do have to address is that, because I mentioned earlier about how this game is really damn easy in the way that you can pretty much gain your MP, like, very easily, yeah, this game is really not that hard of an RPG, so if you're one of those people who just, like, thinks every game needs to be hard as balls, then yeah, you're probably not gonna like this game. But if you're someone that does like easier games, or you're someone that just isn't super great at RPGs and you want like a more beginner entry level one, then yeah, I do think it is pretty decent for that. Well, if you can read Japanese, that is, or you can just wait for a fan translation, because I don't really expect someone who's a beginner-friendly RPG guy to start out with a Japan-only game. And yeah, I would definitely say that the art direction in this game probably is the best part. In fact, if I ever were to make an RPG, I actually really wish it had like a battle system that kind of looked like that with the big sprites and the backgrounds and such. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet, and this is probably like the worst aspect of the game in my opinion, is that I do find that the random encounters in this game are a little bit, like, crazy high sometimes. It's not always consistent, but there has been a few times where I take, like, 2 or 3 steps and then I just run into another battle. So that is something I can definitely see, like, being a little bit annoying for some people. Now, personally for me, I actually did kind of like the battles for what they were for a game made in 1995, and thankfully, at least the battles don't take fucking forever to get through, so sometimes when you do get these random encounters that do happen really quickly, it doesn't take too long to get through, it never feels like a slog. And speaking of slog, this is also a game that is really short, and I know some people would complain about it being too short, but for me, if I'm going to be playing an RPG that has a story that's really nothing to write home about, I would at least prefer it to be a little bit on the shorter side than it being like really long, drawn out, and well, like I said, feeling like a slog to get through. And in case you're wondering, I did beat the game in about 9 hours or something, so yeah, the game is really not that long at all. And honestly, I'm actually okay with a game like this being 9 hours versus it being like 30 hours, because man, a game like this being 30 hours would be way too much. And I've said this before, just because a game is like 60 hours long, it doesn't necessarily mean it's better, because sometimes that 60 hours is mostly just padding a bunch of boring filler shit. And then there's the opposite of that, where you got games that are way too short and you just wish there was a lot more to it. It's like, damn, that was it? And as for this game, yeah, I think it's at the right length to not overstay its welcome. So with that being said, it is a bit of a tricky game to recommend, especially right now, but even if it did get a fan translation, like I said, I think the main people that are going to gravitate towards this game is, well, anyone that really loves the art of the game, like myself, and then there's also just people that, you know, that just want a more chill and easier RPG. But as always, I am glad to have played this game, as it was one that I was always curious about, and despite it not being super great, I wasn't disappointed in playing it. Like, I didn't go into it expecting it to be a masterpiece of a game, but at least I got what I wanted out of it, was just a decent RPG that wasn't super groundbreaking, but does have some really nice art, and some really good music too. So that being said, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.
I want to eat chicken burgers!